Have you ever believed that something not quite human, something from the wild, could feel your pain? One winter night, when a young woman named Lily laid her father's hunting knife on the table and decided it was all too much, 7 towering shadows stepped out of the trees and surrounded her cabin. They didn't growl. They didn't break the door down. One of them simply reached out and knocked the knife to the floor. 4 years earlier, Lily had saved a wounded creature from the mud, stitched its torn arm back together with trembling hands. And now, in her darkest moment, that same creature came back with its family to save her life. This is not just a story. It's a reminder. What we lift from the dirt can someday lift us from the dark. If you're still listening, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? What's your name, dear listener? And how far do you think this story can go? From a quiet cabin in Idaho to your heart, your home, maybe even your healing. From my screen to yours, sending you warmth, wonder, and the wildest kind of love. If this story moves something in you, give it a like, subscribe to join our Bigfoot loving community, and let's keep the forest alive, one story at a time. Late fall, 1989. The Sawtooth Wilderness held its breath beneath a sky the color of old silver. Wind brushed through the thinning trees like someone turning the pages of a forgotten story. Yellow leaves floated down in slow spirals, gathering at the edges of a worn cabin tucked just beyond the last bend of an unpaved road. This wasn't a place you stumbled upon. You either got lost or you belonged. The cabin stood quiet, small, wooden, weathered, built by hands that no longer lived. It sat with its back to the woods like someone too tired to keep watch. Inside, the scent of wood smoke still clung to the walls, mixed with time and silence. A rocking chair rested in the corner beside a window that hadn't opened in months. A handmade shelf held a tin of dried sage, a Bible with swollen pages, and an old toolbox. Its lid rusted slightly at the edges. Everything had a place, and everything had stayed put, except the people. Lily Bronson had lived here alone for the past 4 years. She was 19 now, too young to be haunted the way she was. Most nights, she didn't sleep. When she did, she woke gasping for air, tangled in sheets she didn't remember pulling over herself. Her body always remembered before her mind caught up. Remembered the way the earth shook, the sound of wood snapping, the wet weight of mud. Her parents had died in a landslide when she was 15. She'd lived. That was the problem. She never said it aloud, but it lived behind her ribs. I shouldn't have survived. This morning, like many before it, she stepped out onto the front porch with a chipped mug of tea clutched between her palms. Steam curled into the morning chill, soft and ghost-like. The air was sharp, still. She looked out toward the tree line where fog tangled low between the trunks. Something about the quiet felt different today. Too quiet. No chickadees calling, no squirrels scrambling. Just the dry creak of a tree somewhere in the distance. She took a few cautious steps off the porch. Her boots pressed into the damp earth, which had turned soft from last night's frost. That's when she saw them. Footprints. Massive, human-shaped footprints. Clear, deliberate, spaced evenly, circling part of the cabin. Her breath caught. She crouched down and placed her foot next to one of them. The comparison was absurd. The print was easily twice as long, with defined toes, a deep heel, and no sign of claw marks. Not a bear. She knew bear tracks. She knew elk, deer, cougar, even moose. This didn't fit anything. Lily stared at them for a long moment, then stood, forcing herself to step back inside. Maybe the mud distorted it. Maybe I'm just overtired. Maybe I want something strange to explain why everything still feels broken. She spent the afternoon going through the motions, splitting kindling, wiping down shelves that didn't need wiping, sorting old nails into jars just for the noise of it. But the forest lingered, not outside the cabin, but inside her chest, watching, waiting. By nightfall, the air had dropped 10 degrees. A pale moon hung above the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the clearing. Inside, Lily lit the oil lamp and tried not to notice how the flame flickered against the windows, how every creak in the floor made her jump. Then it hit, like it always did, a wave of panic that crawled up her throat and set her heart hammering like it was trying to punch its way out. Her ears rang. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. She backed against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, eyes wide, chest heaving. She placed a trembling hand over her heart and tried to count her way through it. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. You're okay. You're okay. From the woods, something answered. A sound. 3 knocks. Heavy. Dull. As if something was striking a thick tree trunk with a blunt object. She froze. Then, again. Knock, 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 knock. The rhythm didn't sound random. It pulsed. It echoed. It almost matched her heart. When her breaths quickened, the knocks quickened. When she paused, so did they. She pressed her back harder into the wall, sweat cooling on her skin. Her eyes were glassy, her mind racing. Am I imagining this? Has grief finally cracked me open for good? She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at nothing, waiting for it to start again. But when it didn't, she stood, legs shaky, and walked toward the window. She wiped the fog away with the sleeve of her sweater and peered outside. Just trees. And yet, there, at the edge of the woods, a silhouette, tall, still, not a tree. Its shape was wrong, too wide at the shoulders, too symmetrical. It had arms, a head. It wasn't slouched or hunched like an animal. It stood upright, calm, watching. It didn't move. Neither did she. Her fingers pressed to the glass, barely breathing. The silhouette didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It just stood there like it had all the time in the world. Then slowly, without turning, it took one step back, then another. It faded into the trees like smoke in reverse. And just before it vanished entirely, knock, 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 fainter this time. By morning, the fog had lifted, but Lily hadn't. She stepped outside, still carrying the weight of what she'd seen, or thought she'd seen. She traced the perimeter of the cabin, half hoping the prints would be gone, that this would all dissolve into a bad dream stretched too far. But what she found wasn't a footprint. Near the edge of the porch, where an old piece of railing had broken off last spring, she noticed something resting gently on the wood. A small piece of carved timber, smooth as bone and the size of her palm. She picked it up. 2 peaks. Crude lines carved by an unfamiliar hand, etched into the surface like a memory someone tried to preserve with nothing but determination and something sharp. She ran her fingers across the marks, and a strange ache bloomed in her chest. Sawtooth. It was unmistakable. She'd seen this before. Somewhere. Not recently. Not clearly. The memory sat just out of reach, like a name on the tip of her tongue. A cabin. A flickering lamp. A shaking hand holding a carving just like this. She closed her eyes, willing the memory to come into focus. But all she got was a flash of warmth and pain, and something small breathing shallowly beside her. She pressed the carving to her chest. It didn't answer her questions, but it reminded her she wasn't crazy. Something had been here, and it remembered her. That night, as darkness spilled back into the woods like ink across water, she heard the knocking again. This time slower, calmer, not threatening, almost thoughtful. She didn't rush to the window. She didn't light the lamp. She just sat, curled up by the door, listening. The carving sat beside her on the floor. She ran her fingers along its edge until her hand trembled. "If there's something out there," she whispered, voice barely more than a breath. "Something listening. Why me? Why choose someone who doesn't even want to be here anymore?" There was no answer. Just the knock. Just the cold. Just the woods holding her secret like it had for years. But somewhere, Deep beneath the weight of sorrow and silence, a tiny echo stirred. Like a door she thought was locked had just shifted open, waiting for her to see what had been behind it all along. It was spring then. Not the bright kind, not yet. The kind where the soil's still soft with thaw and the creeks run fast, muddy, angry from snowmelt. A wind that smells like new grass but bites like leftover winter. It was that kind of day. Uneasy, like something underneath the mountain had already begun to shift. Lily was 15, still young enough to think she had time. Her father was patching the roof with a rusted hammer and 2 old nails clenched between his teeth. Her mother was humming and hanging damp towels over a wire near the woodpile, waving gnats from her face and laughing when Lily tried to carry too many sticks at once. Lily's jeans were streaked with mud. Her hands smelled like wet bark. The world felt heavy and alive and ordinary. Then the earth cracked. It didn't sound like thunder. Thunder comes from above. This was deeper, slower, like the mountain had been holding its breath too long and finally let go. Trees groaned. The ground gave way. Lily didn't remember running. She only remembered her father yelling her name, then pushing, hard, toward the back of the cabin. Her feet skidded in the mud. Her shoulder hit the door frame, and she tumbled into the back lot just as the hillside tore loose. She never saw them go under, only heard the long, low groan of the roof collapsing, the snap of timber, and her mother screaming her name one last time. The rain came harder after that, thick, icy drops that turned the air white. Lily climbed, slipped, clawed at the mud with bare hands, calling out even when her voice broke. But the slope had swallowed the house whole, and her cries vanished into the thrum of the storm. By the time someone from Stanley arrived, a neighbor maybe, she never remembered his face, they had to drag her back from the edge. She dug until her nails cracked. Her palms were raw. Then came silence. Long, dense, unnatural. People came. They took pictures. They shook their heads. They said, unfortunate, tragic. The girl survived. They used the kind of words people use when they don't know what to do with your grief. They left. But Lily stayed. That night, after all the lights from the emergency crews had gone, she slipped out alone. No flashlight, no jacket. She didn't know where she was going, only that something in her chest wouldn't let her go far. She kept walking, half-dazed, until her boots found the edge of the old game trail that led toward the forest, and that's when she heard it. A sound, a faint, wheezing cry, not human, but not animal either. It was thin, high-pitched, like a child trying not to scream. It caught in the throat, then came again, a little louder. She followed it, past the trees, past the fallen limbs. Her legs stung from the brambles, but she didn't stop. Something pulled her forward. A patch of fallen trees lay ahead, as if they'd toppled in the collapse. Between 2 thick trunks was a narrow gap. She dropped to her knees. That's where she saw it. A small figure, no taller than a child, but not shaped like one, covered in matted soaked fur the color of tree bark, with one arm twisted unnaturally beneath it, crushed beneath a branch. Its face was scrunched in pain, eyes shut tight, breathing shallow and fast. It wasn't a bear cub. It wasn't a raccoon or a dog or anything she'd ever seen before. Something in her knew instantly. It was something else. Wild, real, hurt. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She crawled forward. And then she saw it. Just beyond the fallen branch, buried in the mud. A jagged metal wire, bent and rusted. A trap. Someone had set a damn trap. The animal hadn't just been caught. It had been thrown here, dragged by the earth and the avalanche and the violence of everything that had just happened. The same landslide that had taken her parents had dragged this creature into her life, broken and bleeding. She didn't think. She just moved. Her hand slid under the branch. She pushed with her shoulder, gritted her teeth. The branch shifted, then rolled with a thud. The creature whimpered but didn't fight. She pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. The fur was soaked through. Mud clung to everything. She wrapped its arm in her flannel and half dragged, half carried it back toward the clearing. Her knees buckled once. She nearly dropped it. But she gritted her teeth and kept going. The main cabin was gone, buried under half the mountain. But the old utility shed still stood. Small, cramped, but still there. She shoved the door open with her shoulder, laid it down on a bed of rags and old burlap feed sacks, and lit the oil lamp. It groaned, barely conscious. She ran back outside, fetched water from the rain barrel, rummaged through her father's old box until she found the orange plastic tackle box. Inside were hooks, thread, and a dull needle, the same one he'd used to stitch up the neighbor's hunting dog once. Her hand shook as she poured whiskey over the creature's mangled arm. It hissed low, almost like a person gasping in pain. She whispered, "Sorry," over and over, like the word might soften what came next. She threaded the line. She had no idea what she was doing, but she remembered watching her dad. She remembered pressure, clean cuts, no hesitation. She tried. It bled, she cried. But it stayed still. When she was done, she wrapped the arm in cloth and sat back on her heels, soaked in blood and sweat and grief. She watched it breathe. Each rise and fall was a small victory. She leaned close. "Don't die," she whispered. "Not you. One of us has to make it." And then its eyes opened. They weren't animal eyes. They weren't wild or empty. They were brown, deep, tired. They looked at her the way someone looks at a hand being offered to them when they're drowning. It blinked. Then slowly, with its good arm, it reached out. Its fingers brushed the back of her hand. Then it passed out. She stayed up all night. The days that followed blurred into one another. She boiled rice into mush and let it cool. She fed it with a spoon carved from a branch. She cleaned the wounds with warm water, changed the bandage when she had to. She gave it space when it curled into itself. Sometimes it let out soft, vibrating hums, low and strange, but not unpleasant. She began to recognize them. One sounded like relief, another like warning, another like sleep. She didn't give it a name. Not really. But in her mind, she started thinking of it as the little one. The little, wild one. The only other thing in the world that had been broken by the mountain and hadn't died from it. She told no one. If she did, they'd come with guns and cages and cameras. They'd put it in a box and poke holes in it and call it science. She didn't know what it was. She didn't care. It had trusted her. That was enough. Weeks passed, then months. Spring turned to early summer. Its coat grew glossier. The wounds healed. The stitches held. It sat up on its own. Watched her when she moved. It learned to mimic her breathing, her gestures. Sometimes, when she panicked in the night, when the memories returned, it would sit up beside her and make the same deep, slow breath she had once taught herself to survive. Then one night it was gone. She had fallen asleep at the small table, her face resting on her forearm. A storm rumbled outside. When she woke, the cot was empty. No tracks, no sound, no door creaking. Just absence. Her heart cracked open in a way she hadn't known was still possible. She searched the shed, the clearing. Called softly, not wanting anyone else to hear. But nothing answered. What she did find, folded gently in the center of the cot, was a small wooden carving. Crude, but unmistakable. 2 jagged peaks, carved with something sharp and clumsy, but shaped with intention. Sawtooth. Again, she didn't know what it meant, but she held on to it. Years later, during a storm, that carving would disappear too, lost in some box or blown behind a shelf, or simply gone like everything else. She forgot. Not completely, but enough to protect herself. Now, back in her rebuilt cabin, holding the nearly identical piece she'd found outside just yesterday, something stirs again. The same shape, the same weight, the same edges. Her fingers curl around it. The past doesn't knock. It leaves signs. And sometimes it waits until the quiet has become unbearable. Then places something right in your palm and says, "Remember." The knife had been resting beneath her bed for weeks. It wasn't a dramatic thing, not at first. It had belonged to her father. Bone handle, leather sheath, still holding the faint scent of oil and pine sap. Just one of the few objects she'd kept after the mud had taken everything else. She'd found it during cleanup, half buried under a layer of fallen leaves, and brought it inside without thinking. A relic, a weight, a maybe. Tonight it was sitting on the floor beside the folded sheet of paper she couldn't bring herself to finish. Her handwriting looked too neat for what it was meant to say. She hadn't planned it down to the minute. It wasn't like that. It was more like her body had simply stopped asking permission. Her limbs moved in that numb, practiced rhythm of someone who's rehearsed goodbye more times than they admit. She'd folded her clothes, set the kettle on the stove without lighting it. Everything quiet, everything still. Outside, the wind stirred low through the trees. A branch scraped the side of the cabin like a fingernail, the kind of sound that usually pulled her attention. But not tonight. Tonight, the quiet didn't feel strange. It felt like silence waiting for her to make up her mind. She sank onto the floor, cross-legged, breathing shallowly. Her hands hovered over the knife's handle. Her fingers grazed the leather grip. She didn't cry, and that's when the cabin shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't the wind. It was pressure. Low, rhythmic, like something heavy had just stepped into the edge of her world. Then another. The water glass on the table rattled once, then tipped and fell, shattering across the wood floor. Her pulse flinched. She stood slowly, knife forgotten, and turned toward the window. At first there was nothing, just moonlight pooling silver across the clearing. Then the tree line shifted. No, moved. 7 shadows emerged from the edge of the forest, not stumbling, not wandering, walking, like they had a purpose, like they knew where they were going. She couldn't breathe. They were massive, all of them taller than any man she'd ever seen, wide and upright, spaced just far enough apart to suggest they were moving in some kind of formation. They didn't make a sound. No twigs cracking, no leaves crunching, just presence. They stopped 20 feet from her porch. She didn't move. Then one of them, slightly shorter than the others, with a familiar slope to its left shoulder, stepped forward. Its right arm was raised, slowly, palm open. Across the inside of the forearm, in the silver light, Lily could see it. A pale scar running from wrist to elbow. Crooked, sloppy, stitched by someone with shaking hands and too much to lose. Her knees buckled. It was him, the little wild one. Grown. Alive. Standing here in the flesh with eyes too human and posture too patient. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, arm raised, like a memory made solid again. Lily's heart pounded against her ribs. Behind him, the others remained still, their shapes broad but not threatening, not towering over her like monsters, just there, witnesses, sentinels. She took a shaky step toward the door, and then something happened. One of them, taller than the rest, with a lighter-colored chest and longer arms, lifted her hand and struck the edge of the porch support with her palm. The sound echoed sharp and low. The knife skittered across the floor and landed near the firewood stack. Lily froze. That wasn't chance. It was a message. She looked up, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move again. But something had passed between them, like a wire stretched taut across 2 lives, humming just enough to be felt. The next breath Lily took came out as a sob. She dropped to her knees. Not in pain, not from fear, from the weight of being seen, truly seen. She covered her face with both hands and shook, trying to keep her lungs from breaking apart. When she finally looked up again, he was still there, the one she'd saved, still scarred, still watching. She took a step outside. The wind circled around her like it knew not to interrupt. The ground felt solid but distant. Her feet moved on their own. Closer now, she could see his eyes, dark brown. The same. unchanged. He took one deep breath in through the nose, then out through the mouth. She mimicked it without realizing. Again, inhale, exhale. Again, her heart started to slow. The tremble in her hands softened. The spinning inside her chest steadied just enough to stand without swaying. They were doing this together. She hadn't noticed how the others had circled wider, almost like they were forming a ring around the cabin, not to trap her, but to shield her, to bear witness, to keep the edges of this moment sacred. She stepped forward until she stood 3 feet from him. Then 2. She didn't speak. She couldn't. He reached up and touched his chest lightly with his open hand, then extended the same hand forward, palm outward, like a symbol. She didn't know what it meant, but she repeated the gesture. Something in the group shifted. A soft weight of presence, an agreement, unspoken. She could feel the eyes on her, not from beasts, from family, from beings that had decided to carry her weight when she could no longer carry it herself. Her legs folded under her. She sat on the porch step and cried, not the broken, hopeless kind of crying, the kind you do when you realize the universe might still be listening. They stayed until her tears quieted. Then, one by one, they faded back into the trees. No branches snapped, no leaves rustled, just silence folding back over the clearing like a blanket. Lily sat alone in the cold, watching the last shadow disappear into the dark. The cabin behind her no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a boundary line, one she wasn't sure she'd ever truly crossed before tonight. She stood, walked back inside, and picked up the knife from where it had fallen. She slid it back into the drawer, folded the note, threw it in the fire, and as the flames ate away the last of what she'd once thought was her ending, a strange new question entered her mind, slow and quiet, like a seed cracking open in the dirt. What if this wasn't the night she was supposed to disappear? What if this was the night she was finally supposed to be seen? The moon climbed higher. No more knocks. No more tremors. Just the throb of blood in her wrists and the echo of breath shared with a being who had never once said a word, but somehow had saved her all the same. The sun never quite made it past the ridgeline that morning. It rose behind a wall of thick clouds, casting a cold, colorless light over Stanley, Idaho. By the time the first gunshot rumors reached the town diner, the wind had already shifted. It carried a scent most folks couldn't place at first. Damp pine, turned soil, something older. But it made people sit up straighter, talk quieter. Something was wrong in the woods. Someone said Lily Bronson had been visited in the night. Someone else said her cabin had been surrounded. Someone swore they saw shadows bigger than bulls weaving between trees. By noon, there were 4 trucks parked crooked outside the ranger station. By 1, there were rifles leaning against passenger doors. By 2, they were heading north. Tom Weller, forest manager, didn't like what he was hearing. He'd lived in Stanley all his life. Knew the trees, the animals, the pattern of seasons like breath. Knew when to raise alarm and when to keep things quiet. But this was slipping. He rode in the lead truck, hands tight on the wheel. Next to him sat Caleb Dunn, local sheriff deputy, not known for subtlety. In the rear view, Tom could see 2 more trucks, one carrying a pair of old hunters, and the other packed with town noise. They reached Lily's cabin just before sunset. The clearing looked calm at first. Too calm. The trees held still like they were listening. The air had the weight of a held breath. Tom stepped out, boots landing soft on pine needles. He raised a hand. The others followed but hung back. Lily was already on the porch. She looked smaller than he remembered. Thin, pale. Her flannel hung loose off her shoulders. Her eyes didn't blink enough. Caleb stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, "you see anything strange last night?" She didn't answer. "Ma'am," he said again, slower. "You want to tell us what exactly happened out here?" Lily turned her head, barely. "They came for me," she said, voice dry like she hadn't used it in hours. "Not to hurt, not to take, to stand." Caleb looked back at the others, clearly annoyed. "What does that mean?" "They were here because of me," she said again, "and because I owed them." Caleb's hand went to his belt. Tom stepped forward now. "Lily," he said gently, "did you see them?"
"I saw 7,
she whispered.
and one of them was the little one. Not little anymore."
Tom looked toward the trees. "Are they still nearby?" She nodded once. "They never left far." Caleb pulled his rifle from the truck. Before Tom could stop him, a shot rang out into the air. Sharp, useless, loud. Lily flinched. But it wasn't the gunshot that shook her. It was the sound that followed. Movement. Fast. Heavy. Branches shifting. And suddenly they were there, emerging from the trees in a slow, unbroken rhythm. Massive shapes. Upright and calm, but no longer distant. One of them had stepped forward, taller than the others. She was female, broad-chested, her face lined with silver fur. Her eyes locked on Caleb. He hadn't expected them to be so human. His hand trembled on the rifle, but it was the youngest, the one with the scar on his arm, who moved next. He stepped in front of the others. Caleb raised the barrel.
"Don't!"
Lily shouted. The bullet fired. It missed the creature by inches, striking a tree trunk just behind. Before the echo faded, the female stepped between them, arms wide, body still. She didn't roar. She didn't charge. She just stood, like a shield. Tom raised both hands. "Put the damn gun down!" Lily ran between them, chest heaving. She stood with her back to the creatures, her face to the men. "They saved me," she shouted, "when no one else could. I was going to die, and they came back. They stood between me and a mistake I couldn't undo." Caleb's mouth opened, but Lily didn't stop. "I saved one of them 4 years ago. I didn't even know what I was doing. I was a kid, and I tried. That's all I did. I tried, and now they've come back to make sure I don't fall." The wind picked up, sending a slow shudder through the clearing. Tom stepped forward, calm. "What do they want?" "They don't want anything," Lily said. "They came because they remember." From the crowd, someone else emerged. Older, stooped. A gray coat buttoned up tight over a black dress. Margaret Rowe, widow. Sharp-tongued, always watching. She walked past the rifles, past the stunned silence, until she stood beside Lily. "You said 7?" Margaret asked. Lily nodded. Margaret's face changed. "I saw one once," she said, loud enough for all to hear. 40 years ago, after my boy Jacob died." Whispers moved through the group. "He was 16, Margaret continued, "and full of wild ideas. Drew pictures of things in the forest. His father hated it. Said boys weren't meant to believe in bedtime stories. One day, Jacob ran off into the mountains after an argument. I followed." Her eyes were glassy now, but she didn't look away from the woods. "I found him at the bottom of a ravine, broken, gone, and someone was there. A figure. Tall, covered in hair, but standing upright. It had wrapped his body in branches and moss, like a burial, like it knew grief." She looked around. "I never told anyone. Not even his father, not the police, not the church, because who would believe a grieving woman talking about monsters?" She turned to Caleb. "If you shoot one of them today," she said, "you'll have to go through me." Then she looked at Lily. "We owe them," Margaret said softly. "Not just you." The crowd behind them fell quiet. Even Caleb stepped back. The youngest creature lowered his arm. The female blinked, slow and steady. And then they all bowed. Not deep, not performative, just enough to acknowledge the story that had been told. Tom Weller removed his hat. No one said another word for a long time. The wind moved again. The clearing held, and somewhere in the trees behind them, something let out a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding for decades. The forest didn't move for a long time. After the creatures bowed and stepped back into the dark, no one dared to follow. The clearing remained still, suspended between breath and disbelief. Even the cold air had stopped shifting. It was as if the trees themselves were waiting to see what the humans would do next. The rifles were still pointed, but lower now, not out of confidence, out of confusion. Tom Weller kept his hands visible. He was breathing slow, lips slightly parted like someone who'd just seen something holy but didn't know whether to kneel or speak. Caleb Dunn stood beside him with his jaw tight, trying to stay in control of something he no longer understood. The others, townsfolk, ranchers, men who'd come with the kind of certainty only a weapon can give, were frozen in the quiet weight of what had just happened. And then Lily's knees gave out. She dropped to the dirt like a string had been cut. Her body folded slowly. Her head tipped forward. Her arms hung loose. It didn't look like fear, not entirely. It looked like something else. Exhaustion, release, the last moment of something unraveling. Tom stepped toward her. "Lily," he said low. No response. Her eyes were open, but glassy. Her chest rising fast. One of her hands gripped at nothing. Her breathing quickened. Margaret reached her first. She knelt beside Lily, one palm pressing gently to her back. "She's overheating," she said, "or shutting down. Her pulse is flying." "I'll call an ambulance," Tom said, already digging into his jacket. Lily's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, from the woods, something stepped forward again. A single figure, massive, broad. Its fur moved with the breeze. It walked in long strides, not hurried, not slow. It wasn't the young one or the silver-chested female. This one was older, male. Shoulders like logs, eyes deep-set, movements deliberate. And he was carrying nothing but his own two arms, open at his sides. No growl, no sound, just breath. He stopped a few feet from Lily's collapsed frame. The people holding rifles stiffened again, but he didn't look at them. He looked only at her. Margaret stood slowly, didn't speak. Then, without sound or sudden motion, the creature stepped forward the last few feet. He reached out and, with both hands, scooped Lily's limp body off the ground like she weighed no more than a bundle of feathers. His fingers cradled her with an unthinkable gentleness. One hand behind her back, the other beneath her legs. Caleb raised the rifle again. "No!" Tom barked, snapping his arm out. "You shoot, and I swear." But he didn't need to finish, because what happened next stopped even Caleb. The creature turned, not toward the trees, not toward escape, toward them, toward the humans, toward trust. He walked in wide, even steps, carrying Lily like a father would carry a child who had fallen asleep in the middle of a story. When he reached Tom and Margaret, he didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He just waited. And after a long moment, he extended Lily's body forward, offering her to them. Margaret's hands trembled as she stepped up. She slid one hand under Lily's neck. Tom supported her legs. The creature released his hold slowly, not fully letting go until he was certain she wouldn't fall. Then he stepped back and bowed his head, not dramatically, just enough. He turned and walked back to the edge of the woods, where the others waited, half hidden in the shadows. But they didn't leave. Not yet, because as the ambulance came, tires cracking frozen gravel, the creatures held position. Not attacking, not fleeing, guarding. When the paramedics lifted Lily into the stretcher and loaded her gently into the back of the van, the youngest creature moved forward again, this time keeping to the trees, but close. His eyes didn't leave her. As the doors closed, Lily stirred slightly under the oxygen mask. Her lips moved, barely. The engine started. The headlights cast long beams that sliced across the forest. And still, they did not leave. Tom drove behind the ambulance. Margaret rode beside him, silent, hands clutched in her lap. The truck rolled slow down the forest road, every window reflecting trees that now felt somehow changed, like they had eyes and hearts and stories they weren't quite ready to give away yet. And somewhere to the side, always just beyond the reach of the headlights, the creatures moved too, following, never too close, never far. A silent procession of watchers who walked where humans could barely see, not because they were curious, but because someone they considered theirs had just been carried away by a machine filled with metal and noise, and people who didn't yet understand what loyalty meant in the old language of the wild. When the ambulance turned toward the lights of Chalice, the figures stopped just before the last bend. The last one to turn away was the scarred young male. He stood at the tree line as the red taillights faded. Then, with the softest breath that barely stirred the grass, he lowered himself into a crouch and placed one hand flat on the dirt. It was a kind of promise. Then he was gone. But the trees did not forget where he had stood, and neither did the people who had seen it. The ambulance had made it down the winding road by dusk. Lights flashing against the tree line, siren off, just the wail of tires and the weight of urgency humming between the wheels. Lily hadn't spoken since they loaded her. She drifted in and out of shallow consciousness, breath irregular, skin pale. The medic kept checking her vitals, tapping a small rhythm on her wrist, maybe to ground her, maybe to calm himself. It wasn't clear who needed the comfort more. Tom's truck followed behind, headlights aimed low through the darkening trees. Margaret sat beside him, hands locked together in her lap like she was holding onto something invisible. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was reverent, like they were inside a church, and the woods around them had become the walls. But they weren't alone on that road. The forest moved with them, on both sides of the winding path, between the pines and firs. Shadows tracked their progress, not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to feel. At one point, Tom glanced in his side mirror and caught a shape moving parallel, tall, fast, deliberate. He didn't tell Margaret. He didn't need to. Her eyes were already locked on the same blur beyond the tree line. By the time they reached the outskirts of Chalice, night had fallen fully. The small regional hospital sat low and square, its windows lit up like an island in a sea of dark. The ambulance pulled around back. Staff were waiting, 2 nurses, an older man in a green vest, a young doctor pulling on gloves. No one asked questions. Not yet. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with that soft electric whine that always made hospital silence feel louder. Lily was wheeled through double doors and into a narrow hallway. Her face looked washed out in the artificial light, but her pulse had stabilized slightly. One of the nurses adjusted her IV. Someone mentioned dehydration. Someone else muttered about overexertion. But none of them said what Tom and Margaret knew. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was something old finally cracking. In the waiting room, Tom paced. Margaret stood at the window, looking out over the parking lot, then past it, toward the ridge. The mountain loomed dark, unlit, but her gaze didn't waver. "They're still out there," she said softly. Tom nodded. Behind the hospital, down a slope that dipped into the edge of town, trees pressed against the fence like they were leaning in. And just beyond that fence, the shapes had gathered. 6 of them now, unmoving, watching, not trying to hide, not anymore. Word had already started to spread. By morning, 2 janitors would mention hearing footsteps on the gravel lot when no one was outside. One nurse would say she caught something huge moving just past the security lights and dropped her tray. But that night, only silence. A protective kind. A stillness too big to explain. Inside the ICU, Lily lay motionless, monitors blinking in rhythm with her breath. Her fingers twitched every so often, curling slightly against the blanket. The doctor had said it might be days before she woke up fully. Margaret didn't believe him. She sat in the corner chair, arms folded tight, coat still on, watching, waiting. At some point past midnight, the hallway outside her room shifted. Not the people. The feeling. Something settled in. Margaret rose, stepped out slowly, and peered down the corridor. Nothing there. But when she looked through the window again, past the blinds, past the frost gathering on the glass, she saw them. 5 stood in a half circle at the edge of the trees. The 6th, Hazel, stood slightly apart, her back to the forest, her face tilted toward the hospital, her body unmoving, her presence sharp. A guard. It wasn't just a visit. It was a vigil. Sometime around 3 a.m., one of the security guards radioed in a strange report. Something about large wildlife shapes near the trash bins. But when officers arrived, there was nothing. Just footprints too large and too even to be bare. Just trees that looked like they'd been touched. Not broken, just touched. The staff stopped talking about it after that. But Margaret noticed something else. The patients, especially the older ones, slept better that night. One woman who hadn't spoken in 2 days mumbled something about a lullaby. A man with night terrors didn't cry out once. In Lily's room, the monitor beeped steadily. Her eyes fluttered beneath closed lids. Then her hand shifted. Her fingers stretched out slowly, palm open, like she was searching for something not in the room. Her breathing deepened. Margaret leaned forward, whispering a quiet prayer. Not the kind from church, but something simpler, older, meant only for that space between two people who've seen too much and still keep hoping. By dawn, the forest was still. The creatures had moved back, but not far. They remained on the ridge overlooking the town, silhouettes against the breaking light. They didn't come closer. They didn't leave. And the town, though small, began to feel it. Something was watching over them. Not from fear, from memory, from a debt. At breakfast, Tom sat with the sheriff and 3 city officials who had caught wind of the sightings. They were talking permits, wildlife control, tranquilizers. One of them mentioned involving Boise. Another hinted at federal jurisdiction. Tom just listened. Then he stood. "This isn't a problem to be solved," he said quietly. "It's a decision to be respected." They didn't get it. They wouldn't. But Margaret did. That afternoon, she went door to door across Stanley, across the outer corners of Chalice, collecting, not signatures. Donations? Small ones. $5, 2 quarters, a couple folded bills in envelopes with no names. They weren't giving money to a cause. They were giving back to a girl who had protected something wild long before they ever believed it was real. Back at the hospital, Lily stirred again. This time her eyes opened halfway. The nurse leaned over, called softly, but Lily wasn't looking at her. She was staring at the window, and beyond it, the ridge. Her lips barely moved, but Margaret could hear it as clear as day. "They didn't leave me." Margaret stepped to her bedside, took her hand. "No," she said, "and they never will." Outside, the wind moved low through the trees, but it didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like a promise, carried in rhythm, carried in stillness. And every shadow that once frightened her now stood still, holding watch, holding space, holding the weight of a girl whose heart had been broken open. Not by violence, but by the quiet, undeniable return of something she thought had forgotten her. But the forest never forgets what it once trusted, and it never abandons what once reached back. The first night, no one said anything out loud. The staff kept their heads down. Nurses moved quietly through the halls. The air in the hospital had changed, like the pressure had dropped or the walls had leaned back just a little to listen. By 3 a.m., the overnight security guard, Travis, called in a report he couldn't quite explain. He said someone, or something, had been walking the perimeter just outside the south wing. Big, heavy, steady footsteps on gravel. When he looked out the window, he saw no one. But the motion lights had all been tripped, one by one, like something was pacing. He stopped short of writing it down. The next morning he just said raccoons, but something stayed with him. Not fear, not even curiosity. It was something else, something colder, deeper. The sense that whatever had walked the fence line wasn't lost. It knew where it was going. It had walked the length of the building not to find a way in, but to make sure nothing else did. On the second night, an elderly man in room 204 slept straight through without calling out. He'd been waking from nightmares every night for months. War memories, screaming, kicking, alarms. But that night, nothing. His breathing slowed around midnight, then stayed calm till morning. The nurse who checked on him found him smiling. The same nurse later on swore she'd heard a low sound outside the east windows around 2 a.m. Not a growl, not quite a voice, something between, like a hum through a hollow log. It was rhythmic, repeating, almost soothing. She didn't report it either. Didn't need to, because by then, they'd all started feeling it. Like something was standing at the edge of the hospital grounds every night, watching. Not menacing, just there. The local paper ran a short piece the next morning. A drawing, done in charcoal, no byline, just the title scribbled underneath in block letters. The forest guards, the weak. The picture showed a line of shadowed figures standing in the trees, shoulders hunched against wind, their faces turned toward a hospital window with light pouring out. You couldn't see Lily in the window, but you felt her. A radio station picked it up a day later. A host in Twin Falls told the story as part of a local interest segment. He used a soft tone when he got to the part about the footprints, about the way no animals had approached the dumpsters for 3 nights in a row, about the woman in the diner who said her dreams felt less crowded lately. He ended the story by saying, "I don't know what you believe. I'm just saying, maybe we're not as alone as we thought." The town didn't argue. Chalice was small, tired, and familiar with silence. And when something good comes through that silence, even if it's strange, even if it walks on 2 legs and disappears before sunrise, you don't push it away. You leave your porch light on. You let it stay. Inside the hospital, Lily's condition stabilized. She still hadn't said much. Her voice was a thin thing when it came out, like a string pulled too tight. But she was breathing easier. The color in her cheeks had returned, faint but real. Her eyes no longer looked through people. They looked at them. On the 4th night, Margaret stayed in the room beside her. The hospital had offered to set her up in the guest wing. She refused, brought her own blanket, pulled the armchair closer to the bed, and fell asleep, holding a paperback she never opened. Just before dawn, Lily stirred. She opened her eyes and turned her head toward the window. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Are they still there?" Margaret didn't open her eyes. "They haven't missed a night." Lily blinked slowly. Her breath caught in her chest, but not from fear. "They followed the ambulance all the way here," Margaret said. "Tom saw them. So did I." Lily didn't answer. Just watched the early morning sky shifting to pale gray. Then she closed her eyes again. She didn't cry, but something behind her eyelids did. Outside, on the ridge beyond the edge of town, the shapes hadn't moved much. Every night, they arrived just after sunset, walked slow, settled at the same overlook, watched the hospital with quiet patience, then left before sunrise, fading back into the trees like mist on water. No one chased them. No one dared. At the hardware store, a few locals started whispering about what it all meant. Were they here for Lily? Were they watching something else? Were they praying? At the diner, a man named Buddy slipped a $20 bill into the tip jar and said it was for whoever's out there keeping our nightmares quiet. The waitress nodded like she understood, because she did. By the end of the week, Tom walked into the ranger station and found 2 letters shoved under the door. One was from a family in Boise who'd seen the drawing in the paper and wrote to say they believed. The other was from a woman in her 70s who remembered a tall one carrying her brother out of the woods in 1954 when they were children. "I never said a word," the letter read. "But I knew what I saw." People were remembering, not inventing. Remembering. On the hospital's 6th night, Lily asked for her journal. She held the pen with shaky fingers and didn't write at first. Just stared at the blank page. Then slowly, carefully, she drew 2 sharp peaks, then a third, then a small sun above them. She folded the page, slid it under her pillow, and closed her eyes. She slept deep that night. Margaret kept watch, one hand on the journal the whole time. In the morning, a nurse walked into the waiting room carrying a box. Margaret stood. Inside were envelopes, folded paper, a few dollar bills, some with no name, just the words, "For Lily." Some had prayers. One had a pressed flower. They came from all over. Tom started collecting them. He didn't organize it. It just happened. People wanted to give something back to the girl who hadn't just seen the forest, but had been seen by it, protected by it, called back from the edge by something ancient and strange and good. By the time Lily could sit up on her own, the ridge outside was no longer empty. At sunset, people began to walk out there, just to see, just to feel. Some brought candles. Some brought nothing but silence. They didn't try to get close. They just stood still, looked toward the trees, and waited. Sometimes they saw nothing. Other times, a figure moved, just enough. Not for show, just to say, "We're still here." One child left a drawing on a rock near the edge of the trail. It was crayon, scribbled and wild, but unmistakable. A tall, fur-covered being with a hand outstretched, standing next to a girl with long hair. At the bottom, in red marker, "Thank you for giving her back." Lily read it that night and didn't say a word. She just folded it carefully and placed it beside the journal. The hospital never made a statement. The sheriff's office never filed a report. But every night the motion lights flickered, and every morning the patient slept just a little deeper. The town had changed, not by force, by witness, by something seen and held gently. And as winter approached, with the mountains preparing to snow and the nights coming sooner, Chalice remained small and tired and still, but somehow safer, somehow less alone. The forest didn't speak in words, but in the way its silence shifted. By the time Maggie stepped beyond the last line of cedars behind her house, the light had started to change. Not fade, but stretch, soften. There was that weight in the air again, the one that made her breath come slower and her hands fall still. A hush that wasn't empty but full, like something was holding its breath. In one arm, she carried Rust Fern. He stirred now and then, head heavy on her shoulder, letting out soft whimpers that sounded like the woods themselves were remembering something old. With her free hand, Maggie held the journal to her chest, its leather cover warm from where she'd kept it close all day. She wasn't sure how her feet knew where to go, but they did. Down the slope where the moss stayed damp even in August, past the hollow stump where her husband once left peanuts for the jays. She moved as if she were walking inside someone else's memory. His memory, his voice, his eyes behind the lens. She reached the spot near the ancient rock face, where roots gripped the earth like weathered hands. It was here that Maggie had first spotted the Bigfoot mother watching from a distance. And now, there it was again. Something just barely visible in the flickering shadow between two wide-trunked pines. She didn't stop. She knelt gently, unwrapped the woven moss blanket, and placed Rust Fern on the cool forest floor. His small hand twitched in protest, then curled softly. Maggie waited. Minutes passed. Then a shift. Barely a sound, but the kind of quiet that moves. The kind of quiet that makes deer freeze. The kind that gets felt in the ribs, not the ears. The mother stepped forward. Not fast, not slow. Just right. Her fur caught the gold of the late sun in thick bands across her arms and shoulders. She was taller than Maggie remembered. Or maybe Maggie had just forgotten how small she herself was in moments like this. There was a scar across the mother's collarbone. Newer, faint. Maggie noticed it but said nothing. She looked down at Rust Fern, then up again. Their eyes met. And there was no roar, no pounding chest. Just a look. Not even wild, just a mother. Maggie nodded once, not even sure who it was meant for. Maybe for herself, maybe for her husband, maybe for the forest. The Bigfoot mother came closer. Rust Fern whimpered again, and her ears turned toward him. She crossed the distance between them like a memory taking shape. Knelt with a gentleness no one would have believed if they'd only seen pictures. Her long hand touched the boy's chest. Her fingers trembled. Her mouth opened just slightly. A sound low and round, rising up. A sound older than language. Rust Fern blinked. His eyes fluttered. And then, the strangest thing. He smiled. It was crooked, sleepy, but real. The mother gasped, and Maggie felt her own lungs loosen, like she hadn't been breathing right in weeks. Then the mother scooped him up. Not like a beast, but like someone who'd done it 1,000 times. And she held him against her heart, and he melted into her, and the woods exhaled around them both. But Maggie wasn't done. She stepped forward again, slowly, and held out the journal. The mother watched her, still and unreadable. Maggie opened it to the page she'd marked. Her husband's sketch. The Bigfoot mother, half seen through branches. Underneath, the words, "She's not the story. She's the soul." Maggie tore the page out. The sound of the tear was the only sound in the clearing. She folded it once, then placed it on the moss. The mother looked down at it, then at Maggie, then back again. A hand reached out, not the one cradling rust fern, and she took the paper like it was something sacred. Maggie whispered, "He believed in you. So do I." And that was all. The mother stepped back into the light-sliced dark, and before the woods swallowed her, she turned one last time. She raised the paper to her chest, and with a nod so small most would have missed it, she vanished. The trees closed behind her like a curtain, and Maggie stood there, alone now, surrounded by the hush. Except she wasn't empty. Something had shifted in her too, like a thread had been rewoven. The next morning, when she walked out to the edge of the garden, something waited there on the old tree stump. A wooden carving. It was no bigger than her hand, made of driftwood, knotted and smoothed. It was a figure, herself, unmistakably, holding something to her chest. A child, a book. It didn't matter. The form was gentle. The meaning was enough. Next to it lay 3 smooth stones, one white, one green, one the color of rust. That night, Maggie built a fire outside for the first time in years. She didn't do anything grand, just sat and watched the flames. She let herself hum an old song she used to sing when she worked night shifts at the hospital. Nothing special, but something alive. Inside, the old camera sat on the table. She'd developed all the film, every photo her husband had taken. In the last roll, there was one shot Maggie had never seen before. A close-up of an eye, not human, dark, vast, reflective. But in the pupil, clear as day, was the silhouette of a man, her husband, not running, not hiding, just standing, watching, witnessing. Maggie held the photo in her lap, fingers tracing the edges. Maybe she'd never get every answer, but maybe some things weren't meant to be answered. Maybe they were meant to be honored. She looked out at the woods. Somewhere out there, rust fern was growing, healing, belonging, and somewhere, his mother was holding the drawing her husband had made. Not to display, not to explain, but to remember. Maggie rose and walked to the edge of the yard. She took one of the stones and placed it gently under the old oak. Then she whispered what she hadn't been able to say until now. "I forgive you," she said. And it wasn't for the creature, it wasn't even for her husband. It was for herself. When the wind came through the trees, it carried a scent Maggie hadn't smelled in decades. Juniper, cedar, and something else. Something soft and wild and old. She smiled, and the woods, it seemed, smiled back. Some stories are not told to explain, but to awaken. They rise like mist from the forest floor, quiet, patient, and full of memory. They are not meant to answer every question. They do not always end with clarity or justice, or the kind of closure that fits neatly into words, but they leave something deeper behind. A breath, a knowing, a trace of warmth that lingers long after the fire has gone out. There are truths we don't find by searching, but by listening. Sometimes the softest voices are the ones that change us the most. Not the ones shouted from mountaintops or carved into books, but the ones carried on the wind, in the hush of a forest at dusk, or in the fragile stillness between two beings who don't share a language but understand each other anyway. This is what kindness does. It bridges what fear divides. Even across species, across time, across generations, kindness leaves a mark. Not loud, not grand, but steady. Worn into the bark, tucked in the roots, passed down in silence. It says, "You mattered to me. I saw you. I did not turn away." And sometimes, that's all it takes to change the course of a life, or to heal one. In a world that rushes to define and divide, perhaps the bravest thing we can do is choose gentleness, to protect what's fragile, to forgive what's broken, to carry something home not because it belongs to us, but because it was never meant to be alone. The forest has its own moral code. It doesn't always make sense to us, but it asks the same thing we do in the end: to be held, to be understood, to be returned, not as we were, but as we're becoming. So maybe the question isn't whether certain creatures are real. Maybe the question is whether we're willing to believe in the kind of grace that doesn't need to be proven. The kind that shows up quietly, that watches before it approaches, that gives even when it might not be safe, that forgives even when no one's watching, because those are the stories that stay. They echo not in headlines, but in hearts. And if you've ever felt alone in the dark and heard a branch crack just beyond the trees, if you've ever left out food for something you couldn't name, if you've ever chosen mercy when fear told you not to, then maybe you already know. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for walking with us through this journey, through every silence, every shadow, and every glimmer of something greater than ourselves. If this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of someone or something or some part of yourself you thought you'd lost, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what stayed with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories about compassion, mystery, and the quiet power of being seen, then please consider subscribing and joining our growing community of listeners who carry these truths in their hearts. Until next time, may you always find your way back to the place where wild things remember kindness.